The crate of nails shifted under the tarp, and that was the only warning Silas Barrow got before a hand closed around his wrist from inside his own wagon bed. "Please." The voice was low, urgent, female. "Pretend I am your wife, only until we are out of town." Silas nearly dropped the reins. Copper Bend, Arizona Territory, baked under the flat white heat of a July afternoon, wagons and horses and shopkeepers crowding the main street thick enough that nobody had noticed the woman climb into his freight wagon 2 blocks back while he was loading feed sacks at the Mercantile. He was 36 years old, a widower 2 years running, and he had not planned on his Tuesday supply run turning into anything more complicated than a long ride back to his ranch outside town. But there she was, crouched among his crates in a pink silk Cheong Sam that had no business surviving a wagon ride through Arizona dust, her dark eyes fixed on his with a desperation that made him understand, before she said another word, that something behind her was worse than anything in front of her. "Ma'am, I don't know you from Sunday," Silas said, keeping his voice low, his eyes flicking to the street where a man in a gray coat was working his way through the crowd with the particular deliberate walk of someone hunting rather than strolling. "You're asking a lot of a stranger." "I am asking for my life," she said. "That man behind you in the gray coat, he is my husband. If he finds me on this street, he will drag me back, and there will be no one to stop him, because in this territory, a husband's claim on his wife is not a thing the law will argue with." Silas followed her gaze without turning his head too obviously, and saw the man in gray pause at a corner, scanning the street with the cold, patient attention of a predator who had done this before. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way shopkeepers seemed to step back from his path without quite meeting his eyes, told Silas everything he needed to know about the kind of man he was dealing with. "Name," Silas said. "Lian Zhou," she said. "Please, I do not ask this lightly." He made his decision the way he made most decisions, fast and without much ceremony, because a man who spent his life on a ranch learned early that hesitation killed more often than boldness did. "Get down low behind the flour sacks," he said, "and if anyone asks, you're my wife come along to help pick out fabric for the house. Name's Silas Barrow. Try to look bored instead of terrified." She was already sliding down behind the sacks before he finished speaking, and Silas turned his attention back to his horses with the studied casualness of a man who had nothing at all to hide, clicking his tongue and easing the wagon forward through the crowded street. The man in gray reached the wagon's path within the minute, stepping directly into Silas's line of travel with a politeness that felt, immediately, like a threat dressed up in manners. "Afternoon," the man said. "Name's Reginald Voss. I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Silas Barrow. Got a ranch out past the North Fork." Silas kept the reins loose in his hands, kept his voice easy. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Voss?" "Looking for a woman," Voss said, and his eyes moved past Silas to the wagon bed, sweeping over the crates and sacks with a thoroughness that made the hair on Silas's neck stand up. "My wife. Ran off this morning without so much as a note. Chinese woman, small build, would have been wearing a pink dress, the kind her people favor. You seen anything of the sort?" "Can't say I have," Silas said, and it was technically true, since he had not seen the woman until she was already hiding in his wagon. "Town's busy today. Lot of faces passing through." Voss studied him a moment longer, and Silas held the look without flinching, understanding on some instinctive level that flinching was exactly what a guilty man would do. Then Voss's gaze dropped to the wagon bed one more time, to the flour sacks stacked just a little too neatly, and Silas felt his pulse hammer even as his face stayed carefully blank. "Well," Voss said finally, "if you do see her, I'd take it as a kindness if you'd send word. She's not right in the head, you understand. Prone to wandering off and making up stories. Dangerous, some might say, if she's not brought back where she belongs." "I'll keep an eye out," Silas said, and Voss tipped his hat and stepped back, letting the wagon roll forward, though Silas could feel the man's eyes on his back for a long stretch of street before the crowd finally swallowed him from view. Neither of them spoke until Copper Bend had shrunk to a smudge of rooftops behind them, and the road had opened into the long, dry stretch of scrubland that led toward Silas's ranch, and only then did Leanne sit up from behind the flour sacks, her face pale and her hands trembling in her lap. "Thank you," she said. "I did not expect a stranger to risk a lie for someone he had never met." "Wasn't much of a lie," Silas said, though his own hands were not entirely steady on the reins either. "Man like that, calling his wife not right in the head while he's hunting her down through a crowded street. I've seen enough cattle handled worse than that man wanted to handle you. Didn't need to hear your whole story to know which one of you was telling the truth." Leanne was quiet a moment, watching the dry hills roll past, and when she spoke again her voice had steadied into something more careful, more deliberate. "He is not a man who loses what belongs to him easily, Mr. Barrow. You should know that before you decide how far you are willing to help me. Name's Silas, and I reckon I already decided that back on Main Street when I let you climb under my flour sacks instead of turning you over to him." Something in her expression shifted then, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, and Silas found himself thinking that he had not seen a woman look at him like that, with something like cautious hope, in longer than he cared to count. Silas Barrow had come to the territory 8 years back with a wife named Charlotte and a modest inheritance, and he had built the ranch out past the North Fork, one fence post and one bad season at a time, until fever took Charlotte 2 winters ago and left him running 400 head of cattle with only a pair of hired hands and a silence in the house that he had never quite learned to fill. He was not, by his own reckoning, an especially remarkable man. He worked hard, kept his word, and did not much care for the kind of gossip that passed for entertainment among the wives in town. But something about the desperate certainty in Leanne Zoe's voice, the way she had gripped his wrist rather than simply asking, had reached past his usual caution and found the part of him that still remembered what it felt like to fight for something worth keeping. Leanne, for her part, had arrived in the territory 3 years earlier as part of an arranged marriage brokered between her family in San Francisco and Reginald Voss, a man who had presented himself, through letters and a trusted intermediary, as a respectable landowner with a modest fortune in silver claims. The reality, once she arrived, had been considerably darker. Voss controlled every dollar that passed through their household, forbade her from working or even leaving their property without his direct escort, and had made clear, through methods Leanne did not elaborate on and Silas did not press her to, that any attempt to leave would be met with consequences she had spent 3 years too afraid to test. That morning, however, Voss had left for a 2-day trip to inspect a mining claim, and Leanne had understood, watching his wagon disappear down the road, that this might be the only window she would ever get. "I had nowhere to go," she told Silas that evening, sitting at the small table in his ranch house kitchen while he set a plate of beans and cornbread in front of her, the first real meal she had eaten without fear coloring every bite in longer than she could remember. "I do not know this territory well. I have no family here, no money of my own, nothing but the dress on my back and whatever courage I could find standing in that street." "You found plenty," Silas said. "Man doesn't climb into a stranger's wagon without a fair amount of nerve." "Desperation is not the same as courage, Mr. Barrow." "Silas," he corrected again, and there was something dry in his voice that made her look up. "And where I come from, They're close enough cousins that most folks can't tell the difference from the outside. The following morning brought its own complications. Silas's ranch hand, a weathered man named Ezra Fontaine, who had worked the North Fork property since before Charlotte died, arrived at first light to find a Chinese woman in a pink silk dress sitting at the kitchen table, and the resulting conversation required Silas to explain, in careful and deliberately vague terms, that Miss Joe was a guest who would be staying on for a while, helping around the house in exchange for room and board. Ezra, who had known Silas long enough to recognize when his boss was not telling him the whole truth, simply nodded and returned to his morning chores, though the questioning look he gave Silas over his shoulder made clear he understood there was considerably more to the story. The bigger complication arrived 2 days later in the form of Reginald Voss himself, riding up the ranch road with 2 other men Silas did not recognize, all 3 of them wearing the particular unhurried confidence of men who believed the law, such as it existed in the territory, would side with them regardless of the facts. "Barrow," Voss called from the yard, not bothering to dismount, "I believe you have something of mine." Silas stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself deliberately between the house and the yard, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm in a manner that was not quite a threat, but was not quite casual either. "Don't recall taking anything belonging to you, Voss." "My wife," Voss said, and the politeness in his voice had thinned considerably since their encounter on Main Street. "Word travels fast in a small territory, Barrow. Someone saw a Chinese woman in pink silk climbing down from your wagon 2 days back, right around the same time my wife went missing. I'd call that more than coincidence." "I'd call it none of your business what women climb in and out of my wagon," Silas said. "But since you've ridden all this way, I'll tell you plain. There's no woman on this property who belongs to you, Voss. Not the way you mean it." Voss's jaw tightened, and one of the men flanking him shifted his hand toward the pistol at his hip, a motion Silas noted without letting his own composure crack. "You understand what you're doing, Barrow, harboring a man's lawful wife against his claim. There are consequences for that kind of interference, even out here." "Funny thing about consequences," Silas said. "They tend to cut both ways. I've got a signed deed to 400 acres and a reputation in this territory that goes back 8 years. You rode in here 3 years back with a story about silver claims that half the assayers in the territory still can't verify. I reckon if this comes down to whose word the territorial marshal believes, I'll take my chances." It was a bluff, and a thin one, but it landed with enough weight that Voss's expression flickered, just slightly, before he mastered it again. Whatever uncertainty about his own standing lived under that polished confidence, Silas had just found the edge of it. "This isn't finished," Voss said, gathering his reins. "I'll be back with the marshal myself if I have to. A wife does not simply vanish from her husband's house without consequence, Barrow. Not in this territory, and not anywhere else." He wheeled his horse and rode off with his 2 companions, and Silas stood on the porch, watching until the dust of their departure had settled back into the dry summer road, his shotgun still resting easy in his arms, though his heart was hammering considerably harder than his composed exterior had let on. Leanne had watched the entire exchange from the kitchen window, and when Silas came back inside, her face was pale but steady. "He will not stop," she said. "You have made an enemy of him now, Silas. He does not tolerate being told no, and he certainly does not tolerate being told no by another man in front of witnesses." "Figured as much," Silas said, setting the shotgun by the door. "Question now is what we do about it." "We," Leanne repeated, something careful in the word. "You're standing in my kitchen, Leanne. Reckon that makes it a shared problem whether either of us planned on it that way." It was that evening, after the ranch had settled into its quiet dusk routine, that Leanne told him the rest of the story she had held back on their first ride together. the part that explained not just her fear of Voss, but the particular danger that made her situation more urgent than a simple bad marriage. She showed him the letter first, worn soft from folding and unfolding, tucked into the lining of her dress where Voss had never thought to search. It was written in her own hand, a copy of a document she had discovered 8 months earlier while going through papers Voss believed locked safely in his study, a record showing that the silver claim he had built his fortune and reputation on was not legally his at all, but had been fraudulently transferred from its original claimant, an elderly prospector named Otis Kellerman, who had died under circumstances the official record described as natural, but that Leanne, having overheard enough of Voss's private conversations, had come to believe were not natural at all. "I made a copy of the transfer document," Leanne said, smoothing the worn paper on the kitchen table. "I did not fully understand at first what I was reading, only that the signature did not match handwriting I had seen elsewhere in his study, and that the date on the transfer came 3 days after a neighbor mentioned old Mr. Kellerman had passed away in his sleep. I kept the copy because something in me understood, even before I could name it, that this was a thing worth remembering." Silas studied the document, his own reading slow and deliberate in the lamplight, and felt something cold settle into his stomach as the pieces assembled themselves. "This isn't just a bad marriage you ran from," he said. "You're carrying proof the man's whole fortune was built on a murdered prospector's stolen claim." "Yes," Leanne said quietly, "and if he ever suspected I knew, and had proof, he would not simply drag me home to correct my behavior. He would make certain I never spoke of it to anyone again." The weight of that settled between them, and Silas found himself reaching across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that the gesture carried its own quiet meaning. "Why didn't you tell me this the first day?" "Because I did not yet know if I could trust you," Leanne said simply. "A stranger who hides a runaway wife in his wagon is one kind of brave. A stranger who is willing to stand against a man like Voss when murder and stolen fortune are involved, that is a different and much heavier kind of brave to ask of someone. I needed to see what kind of man you were before I handed you a reason to be afraid of me instead of for me. And now? Now I think you are the kind of man who does not scare easily," she said, and there was something in her voice, warm and careful, that made Silas understand the conversation had shifted into territory neither of them had quite named yet, but both of them recognized. The next several days passed in a wary quiet, Silas doubling his usual watchfulness around the ranch. Ezra Fontaine, once let in on the fuller truth of the situation, proving himself considerably more useful than his initial confused nodding had suggested, keeping watch on the north road while Silas worked the herd. Leanne, for her part, settled into the rhythms of ranch life with a quiet competence that surprised Silas more than once, mending torn shirts with a precision that spoke of skills far beyond simple housekeeping, and revealing, in a conversation over supper one evening, that she had kept careful ledgers for her family's trading business back in San Francisco before her marriage, a fact that made Silas's own increasingly chaotic ranch accounts look considerably worse by comparison. "You've got a head for numbers," he said, watching her correct an error in his cattle tally that he had been squinting at for 2 days without success. "I had a head for numbers before I had a husband who believed a woman's mind was only good for embroidery and silence," Leanne said, and there was an edge in it that told Silas exactly how many years of herself she had been forced to fold away small enough to survive. It was during this uneasy stretch of quiet that something shifted between them that neither acknowledged directly. Silas found himself lingering at the supper table longer than the meal required, and Leanne found herself watching for the sound of his horse returning from the far pasture, with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with ranch business. Neither said anything about it, but the silence between them, when it fell, had stopped feeling like caution and started feeling like something else entirely, something neither of them was ready to name while Voss's threat still hung over the ranch like weather building on the horizon. The break came 10 days after Voss's first visit, in the form of a rider from town bringing word that the territorial marshal, a stern, unhurried man named Everett Boyd, would be arriving at the Barrow Ranch the following afternoon to investigate a formal complaint filed by Reginald Voss, alleging that Silas Barrow was harboring his wife against her husband's lawful claim and possibly conspiring to defraud him of property. "He's moving faster than I expected," Silas said, reading the note twice. "Filing a formal complaint means he's confident the marshal will side with him." "He usually is," Leanne said. "Voss has cultivated friendships among the territorial officials for 3 years. He has given generously to the marshal's re-election campaign, and generously, in his case, means considerably more than most ranchers in this territory could ever afford." "Then we need more than your word against his," Silas said, and something in his expression sharpened into the particular focus of a man who had found the shape of a plan. "You said Kellerman had a neighbor, someone who might have noticed something wrong with the timing of his death." "A woman named Prudence Halloway," Leanne said slowly. "She ran the boarding house nearest to Kellerman's claim. I heard Voss mention once, in an unguarded moment, that she had asked too many questions after the old man died. He seemed to find it more amusing than concerning at the time." "Then that's where we start," Silas said. "Marshal Boyd's coming tomorrow whether we're ready or not. Best we have something more than a stolen letter to put in front of him when he does." They rode into Copper Bend that same evening, a risk given that Voss's men were surely watching the roads for exactly this kind of movement. But Leanne insisted on going, arguing with a firmness Silas had come to respect that this was her fight as much as it had become his, and that she would not sit safely at the ranch while someone else decided the shape of her own rescue. Prudence Halloway proved to be a sharp-eyed widow in her 50s who ran her boarding house with the same brisk efficiency she apparently brought to remembering details other people preferred forgotten. She confirmed, once satisfied that Silas and Leanne were not connected to Voss's interests, that Otis Kellerman had been in vigorous health the week before his death, had told her directly of his plans to file an updated claim protecting his silver strike from a buyer who had been pressuring him to sell, and had died, according to the doctor who examined him, of causes that Prudence herself had always found suspiciously convenient given the timing. "I said as much to the sheriff at the time," Prudence said, her mouth thin with old frustration. "Nobody wanted to hear it. Voss had already filed his transfer papers within the week, papers that old Otis never signed in front of anyone I knew, and everyone in town seemed content to let the matter rest rather than trouble a man with Voss's growing influence." "Would you be willing to say as much in front of the territorial marshal?" Silas asked. Prudence studied them both for a long moment, weighing something Silas suspected had less to do with courage and more to do with whether the outcome would be worth the trouble it invited. "I would," she said finally. "I am too old to keep quiet about a murdered man for the comfort of a man like Voss." Marshal Everett Boyd arrived at the Barrow Ranch the following afternoon, exactly as promised. A stocky, weathered man whose face gave away nothing as he sat his horse in the yard and studied Silas with the flat, assessing look of a lawman who had heard every kind of story a guilty rancher might tell. Voss arrived not far behind him, flanked again by his two companions, wearing the confident expression of a man who expected this matter to resolve entirely in his favor within the hour. "Marshal," Voss said before Boyd had even finished dismounting, "I trust you've come to settle this quickly. My wife has been unlawfully held on this property for near 2 weeks now." "Held?" Leanne said, stepping out onto the porch with a composure that made Silas's chest tighten with something like pride. "I have not been held anywhere, Marshal Boyd. I came to this property of my own will, fleeing a husband who kept me as a prisoner in my own home for 3 years, and who murdered a man named Otis Kellerman to steal the silver claim that built his fortune. The accusation landed in the yard like a physical blow, and Voss's composed expression cracked for just a moment, quick anger flashing through before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. "That is a delusional fabrication, Marshal. My wife is not well. I have told several people as much already." "Then you won't mind Mrs. Halloway telling the marshal what she witnessed regarding Mr. Kellerman's death," Silas said, and gestured to where Prudence sat waiting in the wagon he had brought her in, along with the copied transfer document Leanne had carried folded into the lining of her dress for 8 months. What followed was not the swift, dramatic confrontation of dime novels, but something slower and more grinding, the particular unglamorous work of territorial justice sorting through competing claims. Marshal Boyd questioned Prudence Halloway at length, examined the transfer document Leanne produced with hands that had gone steady with purpose rather than fear, and sent riders to confirm details with the assayer's office and the doctor who had examined Kellerman's body. Voss protested throughout, his composure fraying further with each new piece of evidence assembled against him, until finally, faced with a signature on the transfer document that a handwriting comparison suggested did not match Kellerman's known correspondence, and a doctor willing to admit under direct questioning that he had signed off on the death without conducting a proper examination as a favor to a man who had since become a generous patron of his practice, Marshal Boyd's patience for Voss's claims ran entirely dry. "Mr. Voss," Boyd said, his voice carrying the particular finality of a lawman who had made his decision, "I'll be taking you into custody pending a full territorial investigation into the death of Otis Kellerman and the fraudulent transfer of his claim. As for your wife's situation, that's a separate matter the territorial court will need to sort through. But I'll tell you plain, I've seen enough here today that I won't be forcing any woman back into a household on your say alone." Voss's men, seeing which way the wind had shifted, made no move to defend him as the marshal's deputies secured his hands, and Voss himself, stripped finally of the polished confidence he had worn through every previous encounter, turned toward Leanne with an expression that had gone ugly with the particular fury of a man watching his careful construction of power collapse in a single afternoon. "You will regret this," he said. "I have regretted a great deal these past 3 years, Mr. Voss," Leanne said, her voice steady despite the visible tremor in her hands. "Regretting your arrest will not be among them." 3 months passed, and the Arizona summer gave way slowly to the long gold light of autumn. The ranch out past the North Fork settling into a rhythm that Silas had not felt in his house since Charlotte's death. A rhythm built not around absence, but around the particular quiet companionship that had grown between him and Leanne in the wake of Voss's arrest and the territorial trial that followed. The trial itself had concluded with Voss convicted of fraud in the fabrication of Kellerman's transfer document, though the murder charge had proven harder to prove conclusively given the doctor's compromised examination, and Voss had been sentenced to a lengthy term at the territorial prison, his silver claim reverting to Kellerman's distant relatives after a lengthy legal process that Leanne, drawing on the very ledger skills Voss had once dismissed as useless, had helped untangle for the territorial court. Leanne had not returned to San Francisco. She had written to her family there, explaining what had happened, and had received in reply a letter that was warmer than she had expected, but that also made clear, in the careful diplomatic language of a family still navigating what a broken arranged marriage meant for their standing, that returning would come with its own complications she was not yet ready to face. Instead, she had stayed on at the Barrow Ranch, first in the guise of the arrangement that had begun on that dusty street in Copper Bend, And then, gradually, in something that no longer required any pretending at all. Silas found her that October morning in the small office he had built off the kitchen, the ranch ledgers spread across the desk in the neat, precise columns she had taught him to keep, and he stood in the doorway a moment simply watching her work, the pink silk cheongsam long since retired in favor of practical cotton, though she had kept the original dress folded carefully in a trunk, a reminder, she had told him once, of exactly how far she had come. "Books look better than they have in 8 years, Silas said. "They looked terrible before," Leanne said, not looking up, though he could hear the warmth in her voice. "It is a wonder this ranch survived your bookkeeping as long as it did. Had other things on my mind most years. And now?" He crossed the room and set his hand on the desk beside hers, close enough that she finally looked up from the ledger to meet his eyes. "Now I've got you to keep the numbers straight," he said. "Figured that frees up the rest of my mind for other matters." "Such as?" "Such as asking whether you'd consider making the arrangement a permanent one," Silas said. "Not the pretending kind, the real kind. I know it's not been a year since you came into this territory running for your life, and I know a woman in your position might want more time before anyone asks her to make promises again." Leanne set down her pen, and something in her expression, careful and open all at once, told him she had been waiting for this conversation as much as he had been building toward it. "I have spent 3 years of my life being told what I was allowed to want," she said. "I find, now, that what I want is remarkably simple. A ranch with honest books. A man who did not flinch when a stranger climbed into his wagon and asked for his protection. A life built on choice rather than fear." "That a yes, then?" "That is a yes, Silas Barrow." They were married in Copper Bend that November, in a small ceremony at the same church whose steeple Leanne had glimpsed from behind the flour sacks on the day everything began, and Prudence Halloway, who had become something of a fixture at the ranch in the months since the trial, stood as witness alongside Ezra Fontaine, who had never once stopped grumbling good-naturedly about the extra bookkeeping Leanne's careful ledgers had revealed he owed the ranch in back wages he had been too proud to ask for. The pink cheongsam came out of its trunk one final time that winter, not for hiding, but for a portrait taken at the new photography studio that had opened in town, the first daguerreotype either of them had ever sat for, Silas in his good coat, and Leanne in the silk dress that had once been the mark of everything she was running from, and had become, instead, a mark of everything she had survived to claim for herself. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.